A millionaire, utterly drained, returned to his sprawling estate, and what he found in the drawing room stopped him cold. His daughter, who hadn't smiled in 2 years, was dancing with the housekeeper's son. What he would discover next would utterly shatter him. Richie Maxwell pushed open the grand front door of his estate, bearing the weight of a man who carried the entire world on his shoulders. It had been an endless day at the offices of the Golden Peaks Hospitality Group, and all he wanted was to reach his room, kick off his shoes, and disappear from the world for a few hours. But barely 3 steps into his own house, his legs stopped responding. From the grand lounge came a sound that paralyzed his entire body, as if his feet had been nailed to the marble floor. It was a laugh, a childlike laugh, crystal clear, free, a laugh that Richie Maxwell hadn't heard in such a long time. He'd almost forgotten how it sounded. It was the laugh of his daughter, Isabella. He approached slowly, holding his breath, as if fearing any noise might break that impossible instant. And when he finally peered into the lounge, what he saw left him speechless, breathless, unable to process what his own eyes were showing him. In the middle of the estate's most elegant room, seated on the floor with an old guitar resting on her knees, was Vanessa Henderson, the housekeeper his mother had hired just weeks ago. Her fingers moved over the strings with a mastery that did not fit a woman who cleaned floors for a living. The melody that flowed from that guitar was soft, enveloping, like an invisible caress that filled every corner of the room. What truly broke his heart was seeing Isabella, his little Bella, dancing. His daughter, that child, who had barely uttered monosyllables since her mother's death, was holding hands with a boy Richie had never seen. The two twirled awkwardly, as only children know how to do, with that imperfect grace more beautiful than any professional choreography. Isabella laughed with her mouth open, her eyes sparkling, her entire body vibrating with a joy that seemed to have been locked away for centuries, waiting for the exact moment to explode. Richie had to hold onto the doorframe because his legs were trembling. His vision blurred, and he felt something warm tracing his cheeks. He was crying. A man who ran a hotel empire, who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without batting an eyelid, was crying silently at the entrance of his own lounge because his daughter was doing something as simple as laughing. "Who are you?" He wanted to ask the boy dancing with Isabella. "What's going on here?" He wanted to demand from the housekeeper who played the guitar as if she were a conservatory artist. But the words wouldn't come out. He stood there motionless, observing a scene that seemed plucked from another universe, from a reality where his daughter wasn't broken by pain. The boy dancing with Isabella must have been only a little older than her. He moved with that overflowing energy of childhood, guiding Isabella with surprising tenderness, twirling her carefully, as if instinctively knowing she was fragile and needed to be handled delicately. Again, Isabella exclaimed in a voice Richie almost didn't recognize because it had been so long since he'd heard her speak with enthusiasm. Vanessa smiled and began to play a new melody, something faster this time, and the two children burst into laughter as they tried to keep pace with their little feet. It was then that the boy noticed Richie's presence in the doorway. He stopped immediately, and his expression changed from joy to fear in a fraction of a second. He let go of Isabella's hands and backed away several steps, lowering his gaze to the floor as if he had done something terrible. "Mum," the boy whispered in a trembling voice, tugging at Vanessa's sleeve. Vanessa looked up, and her eyes met Richie's. The guitar stopped playing abruptly, as if someone had suddenly cut the power. On Vanessa's face, an expression of absolute terror appeared, the kind that only surfaces when you know everything you've built is about to collapse. "Mr. Maxwell," Vanessa said, standing up so quickly that the guitar almost fell. "I can explain. I know I shouldn't have brought my son. It's just that his carer had an emergency, and I had no one else. And I swear this won't happen again." "Who is that child?" Richie interrupted. But his voice didn't sound as he expected. It didn't sound like the voice of an annoyed boss. It sounded like the voice of a man who had just witnessed a miracle and needed someone to confirm he hadn't dreamt it. "He's my son, sir. His name is Tom. My deepest apologies. It will never happen again. Please, don't dismiss me. This job is all I have," Isabella was laughing. The sentence escaped Richie's mouth like a sacred whisper, and Vanessa fell silent, unsure how to interpret those 3 words. "My daughter was laughing," Richie repeated, and this time his voice cracked in a way that made even little Tom look up from the floor to observe this tall man openly weeping in his own lounge doorway. "Dad," Isabella said, approaching Richie with that naturalness only children possess, pulling his hand to drag him towards the center of the room. "Tom is my friend, and Vanessa plays the guitar beautifully. Do you want to dance with us?" Richie knelt in front of his daughter, taking her shoulders with trembling hands. He looked into her eyes and saw something he had stopped searching for: life. There was life in those eyes that for so long had been empty, dim, like windows of an abandoned house. And that life had returned, not because of expensive therapists, not because of imported toys, not because of trips to international theme parks. It had returned because of an old guitar, a housekeeper, and a child who had taught her to dance. "Since when? How long have you been doing this?" Richie asked, turning to Vanessa as he wiped his tears with the back of his hand. Vanessa swallowed, visibly terrified that her answer might cost her job. It wasn't planned, sir. The first time I brought Tom because I had no one to leave him with. Isabella was sitting alone on the stairs. My son approached her and offered to play. She didn't respond, but he insisted. And when I started playing the guitar while cleaning, Isabella simply stood up and began to move with the music. "And no one told me anything?" Vanessa's silence was more eloquent than any answer. Before Richie could process all the information, a sharp voice cut through the air from the hallway like a knife tearing silk. "What is this racket?" Grandma Grace Maxwell appeared at the entrance of the lounge with that upright posture and implacable gaze she had perfected over decades of ruling that house as if it were her own kingdom. Her eyes swept over the scene with lightning speed: the housekeeper with a guitar, an unknown child in her lounge, her granddaughter holding hands with that boy, and her son kneeling on the floor with tears in his eyes. "Richard, can you explain why there's a strange child in my house?" "Playing with Isabella?" Grandma Grace asked, with a calm that was more menacing than any shout. "Grandma, he's my friend," Isabella said with a firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including Richie. Grandma Grace looked at her granddaughter as if the child had uttered a forbidden word. Then she directed her gaze towards Vanessa, and what was reflected in her eyes made Tom instinctively hide behind his mother. "Mrs. Henderson," Grandma Grace said with that tone she used to remind everyone in that house of their exact place in the hierarchy. "You were hired to clean, not to host children's parties in the main lounge, and certainly not to bring your children into a house where they don't belong." "Mother," Richie intervened, slowly rising. Isabella was laughing. "Do you understand what that means?" "I understand that my granddaughter needs appropriate company." Not that of Grandma Grace stopped before completing the sentence, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the room perfectly understood what she was about to say. Little Tom, from behind his mother's back, looked up and said something that left the entire room in a deathly silence. "Madam, I just wanted to play with Bella because she's always so sad. My mum says when someone's sad you take their hand and don't let go until they smile again." Grandma Grace opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in a long while, someone had left her speechless. And that someone was a child who barely reached her waist. "This conversation is not over," Grandma Grace finally said, addressing Vanessa specifically with a look that was a silent sentence. "Tomorrow, first thing, we will discuss the conditions of your employment in this house." And then she withdrew, leaving behind a heavy silence that no one dared to break. Richie looked at Vanessa, whose eyes were red-rimmed, hugging her son against her chest as if she feared someone would snatch him away. Then he looked at Isabella, who had again taken Tom's hand with that silent determination of children who find something valuable and refuse to let go. "Vanessa," Richie said, in a voice that tried to convey a calm he didn't feel. "Don't worry about what my mother said. No one is going to dismiss you." "But sir, no one," Richie repeated firmly. "What you and your son did for my daughter tonight, no salary in the world can pay for that." Vanessa nodded silently, but Richie could see in her eyes that she didn't quite believe him, and he couldn't blame her because he himself knew his mother wasn't going to let things lie. Grandma Grace Maxwell never let things lie. That night, after Vanessa left with Tom, Richie did something he hadn't done in a long time. He sat by Isabella's bed to tuck her in, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, his daughter looked at him with a smile before closing her eyes. "Dad," Isabella whispered, already half asleep. "Can Tom come tomorrow too?" Richie felt his heart tighten in his chest. "We'll see, darling. He told me his dad is also in heaven like Mummy," Isabella murmured, and with that devastating sentence, she fell deeply asleep. Richie remained motionless beside his daughter's bed for several minutes, processing those words. Tom had also lost his father. Two children broken by the same wound had found each other in the lounge of a mansion, and without therapists, without diagnoses, without medications, they had healed each other with something as primitive and powerful as holding hands and dancing. But as Richie processed that discovery, in another corner of the estate, Grandma Grace picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved for special occasions. "Lucy," she said in an icy voice, I need you to come early tomorrow. We have a problem to solve before it gets out of hand." On the other end of the line, Lucy Fielding smiled in a way no one would want to see in the dark. "Count on me, Grandma Grace. That's what I'm here for." What neither of them knew was that this call would unleash a chain of events that would shake the foundations of that estate and expose secrets that had been buried for years under layers of appearances, lies, and a complicit silence that was about to break in the most devastating way possible. The next morning, Richie woke with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't anguish, it wasn't worry. It was curiosity, a deep curiosity that gnawed at him from within, like a flame someone had lit the night before and which refused to die out. Who was Vanessa Henderson, really? That question stayed with him as he dressed, as he went downstairs, as he drank his coffee in the main dining room of the estate. A woman who cleaned floors didn't play the guitar like that. Vanessa's fingers had moved over the strings with the fluidity of someone who had dedicated years, perhaps decades, to mastering that instrument. There was something in her story that didn't fit, a missing piece of the puzzle. And Richie Maxwell was a man who couldn't live with incomplete puzzles. But before he could organize his thoughts, Lucy Fielding was already sitting in the dining room with a cup of tea in her hands and a smile that seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. "Good morning, Richard," Lucy said with that familiarity she had self-granted since Grandma Grace appointed her estate manager. "Your mother told me what happened last night. It must have been very uncomfortable for you to find that situation." Richie looked at her over his coffee cup. "Uncomfortable?" "My daughter laughed for the first time in years, Lucy. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." Of course," Lucy replied quickly, adjusting her tone like someone changing channels. "What I mean is, I understand the emotion of the moment, but your mother is right to be concerned. We know nothing about that woman or her son, and to allow an unknown child free access to Isabella in her delicate emotional state. Tom is not a danger to my daughter," Richie interrupted with a firmness that surprised even himself. "No one says he is," Lucy responded, softening her voice like a snake stroking before biting. "I'm just saying it would be prudent to investigate a little, to know who this woman is before opening the doors of your home and your family to her." Richie fell silent, and though it annoyed him to admit it, a part of him recognized that Lucy had a point, not out of distrust towards Vanessa, but because he needed to understand how a woman with such musical talent had ended up cleaning other people's mansions. That very morning, Richie made a decision. Instead of going directly to the Golden Peaks offices, he asked his personal assistant, a discreet and efficient man named Greg Mason, to investigate Vanessa Henderson's background. He didn't want an invasive or police investigation. He just wanted to understand her story. Meanwhile, in the service kitchen, Vanessa prepared cleaning materials with trembling hands. She hadn't slept a wink all night. Grandma Grace's words kept swirling in her head like a tornado, threatening to sweep away the little she had managed to build. This job was her only sustenance, the only barrier between her and the street, between Tom and hunger. "Mom, are you all right?" Tom asked, sitting in a corner of the kitchen with an old notebook where he drew, waiting for his mother to finish her first tasks before taking him to the local community school. "I'm fine, darling." Vanessa lied with that ability mothers develop to disguise fear with smiles. "I'm just a bit tired." "The lady from yesterday is angry because I played with Bella?" Tom asked, without looking up from his drawing, with that brutal perception children have who have learned to read the atmosphere to survive. Vanessa knelt beside her son and stroked his head. "Don't you worry about that, Tom. You didn't do anything wrong. Playing with someone who's sad is one of the kindest things a person can do." "My dad used to tell me that," Tom replied naturally, like someone mentioning the weather. He said music and friendship heal everything. Vanessa had to hold back so her son wouldn't see her cry. The mention of her husband always reopened a wound that never quite closed. But before she could answer, the kitchen door opened, and someone Vanessa didn't expect to see so early appeared. Richie Maxwell stood in the doorway of the service kitchen, a place he probably hadn't entered in years. His presence there was so unusual that even the cook, Mrs. Marigold, dropped the wooden spoon she was holding. "Vanessa, can we talk for a moment?" Richie asked in a tone that tried to be casual but betrayed nervousness. Vanessa stood up immediately, smoothing her clothes with her hands in an involuntary gesture. "Of course, Mr. Maxwell, in the library if that's all right, and you can bring Tom if you wish." Vanessa and Tom followed Richie through the estate's hallways to the library, an enormous room filled with shelves reaching the ceiling, smelling of old wood and forgotten pages. Tom looked at everything with wide eyes, as if he had entered a fairy tale castle. "Vanessa," Richie began, sitting opposite her with a mahogany table between them, "I need to ask you a question." and I need you to answer honestly." Vanessa nodded, squeezing Tom's hand under the table. "Where did you learn to play the guitar like that?" Of all the questions Vanessa had imagined, that was the one she least expected, and the one she most feared. Her face changed expression, as if someone had opened a door she had been trying to keep locked for years. "That was in another life, Mr. Maxwell," Vanessa replied in a low voice. "A life that no longer exists." "I'd like to know about that life," Richie insisted gently. "Not as your employer, but as the father of a girl who smiled last night because of you." Vanessa remained silent for a long moment. Tom looked at her with eyes that knew parts of the story, but not all. Finally, Vanessa took a deep breath and began to speak. "I studied music from a very young age. My father was a carpenter, but he loved the guitar more than anything in the world. He taught me my first chords before I could read. When I grew up, I won a scholarship to study at the National Conservatory of Music. I was the first person in my family to attend university." Richie listened without interrupting, fascinated by every word. "During my years at the conservatory, they told me I had something special. Not just technique, but something that can't be taught. I was selected to represent the country at an international classical music festival. It was my chance to change my life, my family's life, to prove that a carpenter's daughter could go as far as her talent would take her." "And what happened?" Richie asked, because the pain in Vanessa's eyes made it clear the story didn't have a happy ending. "I met Sam," Vanessa said, and as she spoke that name, her voice transformed into something softer, more vulnerable, as if the name itself were an ancient melody. "He was a luthier. He made handmade instruments. We met because he built the guitar I was going to play at the festival. We fell in love before the guitar was finished." Tom looked up. "My dad," he whispered with a sad smile that no child should know how to draw. "Yes, my love, your dad," Vanessa confirmed, stroking her son's head. "We got married shortly after the festival. I kept playing. He kept making guitars. We were happy. We didn't have much money, but we had music, and for us, that was enough." "And the guitar you played last night?" Richie asked, starting to connect the pieces. "It was the last guitar Sam built," Vanessa replied, and her voice finally broke. "He finished it weeks before the accident. That day he left early for his workshop, like any other. I never imagined it would be the last time I'd see him alive. When they called to tell me the roof had collapsed, I felt the world split in two. Sam didn't manage to get out in time, and with him, everything went. I couldn't play again for months. Every time I picked up the guitar, I felt his presence so strongly that I couldn't breathe. I left the conservatory. I left music. I left everything. All I had left was Tom and the promise I made to Sam that our son would never go hungry." "That's why you started working in cleaning," Richie said. Not as a question, but as a realization that hit him in the chest. "No one hires a guitarist to pay household bills, Mr. Maxwell, but every house needs someone to clean it. So I put Sam's guitar back in its case and learned to use a broom. And every night, when Tom was asleep, I would take out the guitar and play in silence, just to feel that he was still near." Richie had to look away because his eyes had filled with tears he didn't want to show. Vanessa's story had opened a wound he also carried, that of a man who had lost the woman he loved and didn't know how to move on. Every day after school, he should come here, play with Isabella. You play the guitar, do what you did last night. Every day. "Mr. Maxwell, your mother." "My mother is my concern." Richie read Greg Mason's message 3 times before picking up the phone to call him. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number, and every second that passed without an answer felt like an eternity. When Greg finally picked up, his voice had that grave tone he only used when the news was serious. "Mr. Maxwell, what I found isn't something I can tell you over the phone. Can you receive me at the estate?" "Come straight away," Richie replied and hung up, feeling a knot form in his stomach. While waiting for Greg, Richie went down to find Vanessa to deal with something that couldn't be postponed any longer. Grandma Grace had announced the previous night that she would speak with Vanessa first thing, and Richie needed to get there before his mother to protect the housekeeper from whatever she was planning. But when he reached the main foyer, it was already too late. Grandma Grace stood in front of Vanessa, who kept her head down, holding a cleaning rag in her hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground. A few meters away, Lucy Fielding observed the scene, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, and an expression of satisfaction she tried to conceal with little success. "I will explain this once and only once, Mrs. Henderson," Grandma Grace said in that voice that seemed made of polished ice. "This house has rules that existed long before you arrived and will continue to exist long after you leave. Employees do not mix their personal lives with their work. The children of employees do not play with the children of the masters. And no one, absolutely no one, plays musical instruments in the main lounge as if this were a tavern. Mrs. Maxwell, I assure you it won't happen again. I'm not finished, Grandma Grace interrupted, raising a hand with the authority of someone accustomed to the entire world stopping when she spoke. What you did last night was not simply bring your child without authorization. What you did was take advantage of my granddaughter's vulnerability. Isabella is a fragile child undergoing professional treatment, and you, without any preparation or right, decided to play therapist with a guitar. I never intended. What you intended or didn't intend is irrelevant. Results are what matter. And the result is that my granddaughter will now develop an emotional dependence on your son and on you, which will complicate all the work that true professionals have been doing. Richie clenched his fists at his sides. Every word from his mother burned inside him, but he knew that interrupting Grandma Grace in the middle of one of her speeches would only make things worse. He needed to wait for the right moment. So, these are the new conditions. Grandma Grace continued, pulling a folded paper from her jacket pocket. First, your son will not set foot in this house again under any circumstances. Second, you are strictly limited to your cleaning duties, without interacting with Isabella beyond what is strictly necessary. Third, that guitar disappears from this property today. If you accept these conditions, you can keep your job. If you don't accept them, Lucy has your severance ready. Lucy nodded from her corner, holding up an envelope that indeed contained prepared documents. Everything had been calculated, orchestrated, like a military operation designed to leave no escape. Vanessa looked up for the first time since the conversation began, and Richie could see something in her eyes that tore him in half. It wasn't fear, it wasn't submission, it was the pain of someone being asked to give up the last remnant of the person they loved. Her guitar, the guitar where Sam's soul lived. Mrs. Maxwell, Vanessa said, in a voice that trembled but refused to break entirely. I can accept not bringing my son, I can accept limiting myself to my duties, but that guitar is the only thing I have left of my husband. It is the only thing my son has of his father. I cannot, Mother. Enough! Richie's voice cut through the room like lightning striking an ancient tree. Everyone turned towards him. Grandma Grace with surprise, Lucy with alarm, and Vanessa with a mixture of relief and terror that his intervention might make everything worse. Richard, this is a conversation about household management. And as I've always told you, this is a conversation about my daughter, Richie interrupted, walking towards the center of the foyer with firm steps. Isabella is my daughter, not an administrative project. And what Vanessa and Tom achieved in one afternoon is more than any professional has achieved in years. So there will be no new conditions, no severance, and that guitar is not leaving this house. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to have physical form. Grandma Grace looked at her son with an expression Richie knew all too well, that of a woman unaccustomed to losing battles and with no intention of starting now. You're making a mistake, son, Grandma Grace said in a low voice, almost a whisper. And when the consequences arrive, I hope you remember this moment. Grandma Grace withdrew with Lucy on her heels, and the foyer fell silent. Vanessa was visibly trembling, and Richie had to resist the urge to approach and reassure her, aware that any gesture of closeness could undoubtedly be misinterpreted by the eyes that were watching from every corner of that house. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell, Vanessa whispered. Don't thank me. For what you did for Isabella, I should be on my knees thanking you. Before he could say anything more, the doorbell of the estate rang. It was Greg Mason, punctual as always, with a briefcase under his arm, and an expression that confirmed what he brought was not simple. Richie received him in his private study, locking the door. Greg opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it on the desk with the delicacy of someone handling explosive material. Sir, I did a basic search as you requested. Public records, digital archives, press releases. What I found was unexpected. Richie opened the folder. The first pages were digital clippings from newspapers and cultural magazines dating back several years. All of them featured the name Vanessa Henderson, associated with the National Conservatory of Music, but not as just any student. Vanessa Henderson was considered one of the most talented guitarists of her generation, Greg explained, as Richie read with increasingly wide eyes. She won 3 national awards before completing her training. She was selected to represent the country at the International Music Festival in Vienna. The press called her the voice of the strings. She was, according to all experts, an artist destined to change the history of classical music on our continent. And what happened? Richie asked, although he already knew part of the answer thanks to that morning's conversation in the library. That's where things get complicated, sir, Greg said, turning to the next section of the folder. Vanessa's husband, Sam Henderson, was a luthier, a renowned artisan who made instruments for professional musicians. But what Vanessa probably didn't tell you is exactly how he died. Richie stopped reading and looked directly into his assistant's eyes. Sam Henderson worked making instruments in a workshop that operated within an industrial building. That building was owned by a corporate conglomerate that for years ignored warnings about structural problems and safety conditions. One day, part of the workshop roof collapsed. Sam was the only worker who didn't manage to get out in time. My God, Richie murmured. But that's not all, sir. Vanessa tried to sue the company that owned the building. She hired a lawyer with the few savings she had, but the company had a powerful legal team that crushed the case before it even reached trial. She received no compensation whatsoever, and the legal expenses left her utterly ruined. She lost her flat, lost her savings, lost everything, and the company never took responsibility. Richie felt each revelation hit his chest harder than the last, but what Greg said next made the ground disappear beneath his feet. Sir, I investigated which company owned that industrial building, the conglomerate that ignored the safety warnings that let Sam Henderson die, and that then legally destroyed his widow so as not to pay a cent in compensation. Greg paused, a pause that seemed to last an eternity. The building belonged to Maxwell Holdings, the company your father founded, and which your mother managed during the years you were exclusively dedicated to the hotel business. Richie stood completely motionless. His brain tried to process the information, but it was as if Greg's words were written in a language he suddenly couldn't understand. You're telling me my family, my father's company, is responsible for the death of Vanessa's husband. I'm telling you that Maxwell Holdings was the owner of the building where Sam Henderson died, and that the legal team that crushed Vanessa's lawsuit was hired and directed by one person. Who? Grandma Grace Maxwell, your mother. The world stopped turning for Richie in that instant. The walls of his study seemed to close in on him as his mind desperately tried to connect the pieces of a monstrous puzzle. His mother had hired Vanessa weeks ago. His mother, who now wanted to dismiss her with such urgency. His mother, who had destroyed that woman's life before, without anyone knowing. Does Vanessa know? Richie asked in a strained voice. Does she know she works in the house of the family that destroyed her life? That I couldn't determine, sir. But there's something else. More? Greg pulled the last page from the folder. It was a copy of a hospital record. Your wife, Mrs. Caroline Maxwell, before she passed away, was admitted to Hope Valley Hospice. During her last weeks, she received regular visits from a volunteer who kept her company and played the guitar to alleviate her pain. That volunteer signed the visitor's log with her full name. Richie took the sheet with trembling hands and read the name written on the visitor line. Vanessa Henderson. The sheet slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor as Richie collapsed into his chair, unable to bear the weight of a truth that had just split his life into two irreconcilable halves. Before knowing, and after. The woman who cleaned his house had comforted his dying wife. The woman whose life his mother had destroyed had spent the last weeks playing guitar by Caroline's bedside so she wouldn't die alone. And neither of them had ever known who the other was. Richie didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, Greg's revelations replayed in his mind like a horror movie he couldn't turn off. His mother had destroyed Vanessa's life. His wife, Caroline, had been comforted by Vanessa in her final days, and now that same woman was cleaning the floors of Maxwell Manor, unaware she slept under the same roof as the people responsible for her tragedy. Or perhaps she did know. That possibility tormented him the most. What if Vanessa had deliberately sought this job? What if it was all part of a plan? What if the guitar, the games with Isabella, the connection with Tom, were pieces of a carefully designed revenge? But then Richie remembered Vanessa's eyes when she spoke of Sam in the library. He remembered the tremble in her voice, the way her son looked at her with that mixture of admiration and concern. No one could fake that level of pain. No one could fabricate that kind of truth. The next morning, Richie made a decision that filled him with fear, but which he knew was necessary. He was going to speak with Vanessa and tell her everything he had discovered. He couldn't keep looking her in the eyes while carrying that secret. But before he could find her, something happened that completely changed the course of that day. Isabella woke up humming. Richie was in the hallway when he heard the melody coming from his daughter's room. He stopped, hand on his heart, paralyzed for the second time in a few days by a sound he believed impossible. He approached the half-open door and saw Isabella, sitting on her bed, wiggling her bare feet as she hummed the same song Vanessa had played on the guitar that first night. "Dad," Isabella said, noticing him in the doorway. "Tom is coming today." Richie knelt by his daughter's bed and stroked her hair. "Yes, darling." Tom is coming today. I want him to teach me to dance better. He knows how to spin around lots without falling over. Richie smiled with moist eyes. His daughter was planning activities, expressing desires, looking towards the future things the best specialists had tried to achieve for years without success. He decided he needed a professional opinion before speaking with Vanessa. He called Dr. Ethan Davies, the child therapist who had been treating Isabella since Caroline's passing. Dr. Davies was a man of calm voice and deep gaze, who had dedicated his life to healing the invisible wounds of children. What you describe is extraordinary, Mr. Maxwell, Doctor. Davies said after hearing everything that had happened. Isabella had built an emotional wall as a defense mechanism against the loss of her mother. No conventional therapeutic technique had managed to penetrate it because that wall was made of the most resilient material there is. The pain of a child who lost the person they loved most. And how is it possible that a child and a guitar achieved what years of therapy couldn't? Because children don't analyze pain, Mr. Maxwell. Children simply feel it. And when Isabella found another child who carried the same wound, something happened that in psychology we call emotional recognition. Tom didn't try to cure Isabella. He simply showed her she wasn't alone, and that was enough for her to decide for the first time that it was worth feeling again. Doctor, I need you to come to the estate. I need you to evaluate Isabella and tell me exactly what we should do, not to ruin this progress. I'll be there this afternoon, Doctor, Davies confirmed. But while Richie arranged the therapist's visit, in another corner of the estate, something far less noble was brewing. Lucy Fielding had spent the entire night studying the letter she had intercepted from the National Conservatory of Music. The content of that letter was a bomb that could destroy Vanessa or elevate her, depending on who detonated it and with what intention. The letter informed Vanessa that the conservatory had initiated a special re-entry program for talented former students who had abandoned their studies due to extraordinary circumstances. The program included a full scholarship, access to international teachers, and the possibility of resuming her musical career exactly where she had left off. The conservatory not only remembered Vanessa Henderson, but was actively seeking her because one of her former professors had launched a campaign to recover the lost talents of her generation. Lucy immediately understood the power of that information. If Vanessa received that letter, she would have a chance to rebuild her life away from Maxwell Manor. She would leave, she would take Tom, and Isabella would lose the only connection that had made her smile again. Richie would blame Vanessa for abandoning them, and everything would go back to how it was before. But Lucy didn't just want Vanessa to leave. She wanted her to leave disgraced, humiliated, marked as someone who could never be trusted. Because Lucy had seen how Richie looked at Vanessa and recognized that look. It was the same look she had been waiting years for Richie to direct at her. So Lucy devised a plan. A plan she presented to Grandma Grace that very morning while they had tea in the back garden. "We're not going to deliver the letter," Lucy explained, with the precision of someone who had studied every detail. "But we will use it. We're going to make it seem like Vanessa was using her position in this house for personal gain, that she intentionally approached Isabella to gain Richie's trust and obtain contacts that would allow her to return to the music world." Grandma Grace listened attentively, and in her eyes shone something Lucy interpreted as approval. But the truth was that in Grandma Grace's mind, much more complex and darker calculations were at play. She not only wanted to protect her home from an employee who had crossed boundaries, she needed Vanessa to disappear before anyone discovered the connection between Maxwell Holdings and Sam Henderson's death. Because if Richie discovered that truth, not only would she lose her son forever, but the entire family empire would crumble under the weight of a scandal that no lawyer could contain. "Do it," Grandma Grace said with the coldness of one signing a sentence. "But make it clean. I don't want any scandals." That afternoon, while Dr. Davies evaluated Isabella in the library, Lucy executed the first phase of her plan. She waited for Vanessa to be cleaning the west wing of the estate and quietly entered the small room the housekeeper used to store her belongings during the workday. There, she found what she was looking for: Sam's guitar case. Lucy carefully opened the case and placed inside an object that would bring Vanessa's entire world crashing down. A diamond bracelet that belonged to Grandma Grace, an antique, family, invaluable piece, the kind of object whose disappearance would provoke an immediate investigation and whose discovery in an employee's belongings would leave no room for doubt. She closed the case, left it exactly as she had found it, and exited the room with the same discretion with which she had entered. The bracelet would be reported missing that very night. The search would inevitably lead to Vanessa's belongings, and when they opened that case in front of Richie, there would be no possible explanation to save the guitarist. Meanwhile, in the library, Dr. Davies finished his evaluation of Isabella with results that left Richie speechless. "Your daughter has experienced an emotional breakthrough that I would classify as extraordinary," the doctor said, reviewing his notes with an expression of genuine astonishment. "Not only has she regained the ability to express positive emotions, but she is developing new emotional bonds, something that weeks ago seemed completely impossible. And what do you recommend, doctor? That you change absolutely nothing. Isabella's connection with that child, and with Vanessa's music, is therapeutic on a level that science is just beginning to comprehend. To interrupt that bond now would be like uprooting a plant that has just sprouted after years of drought." Richie nodded, and at that moment he decided that neither his mother, nor Lucy, nor anyone in the world was going to separate Isabella from the people who had managed to give her life back. But life has a cruel way of testing our determinations at the exact moment we believe ourselves strongest. That night, after Vanessa finished her shift and prepared to leave with Tom, Grandma Grace's voice resonated throughout the ground floor of the estate like a blood-chilling alarm. "My bracelet, my mother's bracelet, has disappeared." In a matter of minutes, the entire estate mobilized. Grandma Grace demanded every room, every corner, every possession be searched. Lucy directed the search with suspicious efficiency, subtly guiding staff towards the wing where Vanessa kept her things. Richie watched the scene with a bad feeling twisting his gut. Something wasn't right. His mother had worn that bracelet hundreds of times and never lost it. Why now, of all times? But before he could intervene, one of the staff members participating in the search approached Lucy with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss Fielding, we found something in Mrs. Henderson's room." The silence that fell over the estate was sepulchral. All eyes turned to Vanessa, who stood by the front door with Tom holding her hand, ready to go home. Her face reflected absolute confusion, that of someone who didn't understand why everyone was suddenly looking at her as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. Lucy walked to Vanessa's room and returned holding the open guitar case. Inside, gleaming under the foyer lights like a silent accusation, was Grandma Grace's diamond bracelet. "No," Vanessa whispered, shaking her head as she took a step back. "That's not possible. I would never." "The evidence speaks for itself," Grandma Grace declared, with a coldness that could have frozen the sun. Richie watched the scene, feeling his brain process 1,000 possibilities per second. Sam's guitar. They had put the bracelet inside Sam's guitar, not in a handbag, not in a drawer, but in the most sacred object Vanessa possessed. And that was exactly what didn't make sense, because no one who hides something stolen puts it in the one place they know they protect with their life. Someone had put that bracelet there. Someone who knew exactly what that guitar meant to Vanessa, and who had chosen that hiding place on purpose so that the accusation would be more devastating, more personal, more impossible to refute. And as Richie reached that conclusion, little Tom let go of his mother's hand, stepped forward, and with the trembling but firm voice of a child who had seen too many injustices to stay silent, said something that froze everyone present in their tracks. "My mom would never put anything inside that guitar. That guitar belongs to my dad. It's the most important thing we have. If someone put that in there, it was someone who wants to hurt my mum. And I know there are people in this house who don't want us here." Tom's eyes, without pointing at anyone specifically, swept the foyer with a clarity that unsettled even Grandma Grace. And Lucy, for the first time since she had designed her perfect plan, felt something she hadn't anticipated. Fear. Fear of a child who had just spoken the most dangerous truth of all. Not because he had proof, but because he had said it with the unwavering conviction of someone who knows his mother's heart better than anyone else in the world. Tom's words hung in the foyer air like a sentence no one dared to touch. Richie looked at the boy with an admiration that hurt his chest, because that little one had just done what no adult in that mansion had had the courage to do. Speak the truth without embellishment or calculation. But Grandma Grace was not a woman to be destabilized by a child's words. "How touching," she said with that icy smile she used when she felt threatened but would never admit it. A child defending his mother. It's natural, it's understandable, but feelings don't erase evidence. "The bracelet was found among your belongings, Mrs. Henderson." "That is a fact that someone fabricated," Richie responded, stepping forward, interposing himself between his mother and Vanessa like a human shield. "Are you accusing someone in this house of planting false evidence?" Grandma Grace asked, raising an eyebrow with perfectly feigned incredulity. "Who exactly, Richard? Me? Lucy? The staff who have worked here for years with unimpeachable loyalty? I'm saying Vanessa didn't put that bracelet there. And how can you be so sure? You've known her for what, weeks? I've lived in this house for decades. I've looked after every object, Every memory, every piece of this family. And you prefer to believe a stranger over your own mother? Grandma Grace's words were designed to hit exactly where it hurt most. Family loyalty. And Richie could feel those words finding their mark. Because despite all he knew, despite Greg's revelations, she was still his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had supported him through the worst moments of his life, who had held this family together when his father died. It was that instant of hesitation that Vanessa perceived with the sensitivity of someone who had learned to read silences to survive. "Mr. Maxwell," Vanessa said in a voice that had found unexpected calm amidst the chaos. "You don't need to fight with your mother for me. I know what I did and what I didn't do. My conscience is clear." She bent down, picked up the guitar case with the bracelet still inside, and placed it gently on the foyer table. Then she took Sam's guitar, the only possession that truly mattered to her in the world, and held it against her chest as if embracing a living person. "They can keep the bracelet. They can search every corner of my life if they want. They won't find anything because there's nothing to find. The only thing I'm taking from this house is what I brought with me, my guitar and my son." "Vanessa, wait," Richie said in desperation, but she was already walking towards the door. "Mum, aren't we coming back?" Tom asked softly, holding her hand as they walked. Vanessa didn't respond. She couldn't, because if she opened her mouth at that moment, she would break down completely in front of the very people who had orchestrated her humiliation. And that was something her pride, the only intact inheritance she had left, was not willing to allow. The days that followed were the darkest. Maxwell Manor had known since Caroline's death. Isabella stopped humming, stopped asking for someone to play with her, stopped going down to the lounge where she had once danced with Tom. She locked herself in her room with that silent determination of children who decide the world has already harmed them too much, and the only way to protect themselves is to disappear from within. Dr. Davies visited the estate several times, and each visit ended with the same devastating diagnosis. "Isabella is regressing, Mr. Maxwell, and she is doing so faster than she progressed. If we don't recover the stimulus that caused her emotional opening, there's a risk she could close off permanently." "Permanently? What exactly does that mean, Doctor?" Dr. Davies' silence before answering was the most terrifying response Richie had ever received. "It means we could lose her, Mr. Maxwell. Not physically, but emotionally. There is a point in a child's emotional closing process from which there is no return. If Isabella crosses that threshold, no therapy, no stimulus, no intervention will be able to bring her back." Richie left Dr. Davies' study trembling. He needed to find Vanessa. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. Every hour that passed was another hour closer to losing his daughter forever. But the city was huge, and Vanessa didn't want to be found. Richie hired investigators, checked records, contacted community schools where Tom might have enrolled, visited shelters, asked at churches in neighborhoods where people went when they had nowhere else to go. Nothing. Vanessa Henderson had disappeared with the efficiency of someone who already knew what it was to lose everything and start from scratch. As Richie consumed himself searching for Vanessa, something began to change within the estate. The atmosphere grew heavy, as if the walls themselves knew an injustice had been committed under their roof and were demanding reparation. The service staff whispered in the hallways. Mrs. Marigold, the cook, stopped preparing Grandma Grace's favorite dishes without explanation. The gardeners avoided crossing paths with Lucy as if her presence caused them something they couldn't express in words, and it was precisely Mrs. Marigold, who one day approached Richie with the caution of someone who knows what they are about to say, can have huge consequences. "Mr. Richard, forgive me for sticking my nose in where it doesn't belong," the cook said in a low voice, making sure no one else could hear. "But my conscience won't let me sleep. The night the bracelet disappeared, I was in the kitchen preparing the next day's bread. From the kitchen, you can see the hallway leading to the room where Mrs. Henderson kept her things." Richie stopped breathing. That night, long before all the fuss, I saw Miss Fielding enter that room. She was inside for several minutes and came out empty-handed. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but after what happened, sir, Vanessa didn't put that bracelet there. I tell you with the certainty of a woman who has seen honesty and lies pass through this kitchen for many years. That girl is innocent, Mrs. Marigold's testimony fell upon Richie like the last piece of a puzzle he already knew but needed someone else to confirm. Lucy had planted the bracelet, his mother had authorized it, and between the two of them, they had driven the only person who had managed to give Isabella life back out of that house. Richie walked directly to his mother's study. He didn't knock on the door. He opened it wide and found Grandma Grace sitting at her desk, reviewing documents as if the world wasn't crumbling around her. We need to talk, Mother, and this time you're going to tell me the truth. Richard, I don't know what your Lucy planted the bracelet in Vanessa's things. I have a witness, and before you try to discredit them, you need to know something else. I know about Maxwell Holdings. I know about the collapsed building. I know what you did to Vanessa Henderson years before she ever set foot in this house. Grandma Grace's face changed, as if someone had torn off a mask she had worn for decades. There was no immediate denial, no manufactured indignation. There was something far more disturbing. Silence. A silence that admitted everything without uttering a single word. And there's something you don't know either, Mother. Something that breaks my heart to have to tell you. What? Vanessa was the person who comforted Caroline in her last days. While you were arranging funerals and I was drowning in my grief, an unknown woman sat by my wife and played the guitar so she wouldn't feel afraid to leave. That woman was Vanessa, the same woman whose husband died due to our company's negligence. The same woman you just expelled from our lives as if she were rubbish. Grandma Grace brought her hand to her chest. For the first time in Richie's life, he saw something in his mother's eyes he never thought possible: remorse. A remorse so deep and so ancient it seemed to have been buried under tons of pride, waiting for this exact moment to surface and claim what was due. Richard, Grandma Grace whispered. But her son had already left the study because Richie Maxwell no longer had time for explanations or apologies. His daughter was fading. Vanessa was missing, and every second that passed was a second he couldn't get back. That same night, as he reviewed the investigators' reports one last time without finding anything, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Maxwell," said a female voice he didn't recognize. "My name is Rachel Owens. I'm the director of the Open Arms Community Shelter. A woman arrived here a few days ago with her young son. She doesn't want to give her real name, but the boy tells everyone his dad lives inside a guitar. I found your number on a card the boy kept in his pocket. I think you're the person this boy wants to find." Richie grabbed his car keys before the woman finished speaking. Richie drove through the city streets like a man possessed. The traffic lights became blurred streaks through the windscreen as he repeated Rachel Owens' words in his mind. A child who says his dad lives inside a guitar. Only one child in the entire world said that phrase. Only one. The Open Arms Community Shelter was in an area of the city Richie had never set foot in. The streets grew narrower as he drove, the buildings shorter, the footpaths more cracked. When he finally parked in front of the shelter, he had to stay in the car for a few seconds, trying to control the trembling in his hands before getting out. The building was a modest construction, with walls painted a color that was once cheerful, but which time had turned into a tired shade. A plaque by the door read, "Open Arms Community Shelter, because no one should face the night alone." Rachel Owens was waiting for him at the entrance. She was a woman with a firm gaze and hands hardened by years of social work. The kind of person who had seen so much suffering that she was no longer surprised by anything, but who also hadn't hardened enough to stop being moved. "Mr. Maxwell, before you go in, I need to explain something," Rachel said in a serene but direct voice. When the woman and child arrived here, she was in a very fragile emotional state. She didn't want to give her real name. She registered as Mary. But the boy... Children don't know how to lie when something hurts them. Tom told anyone who would listen that his mum played the most beautiful guitar in the world and that he missed a girl named Bella. The name of his daughter on that boy's lips made Richie feel a direct blow to the center of his chest. "I found her crying one night in the shelter yard," Rachel continued. "She was sitting on the ground, hugging her guitar, rocking it as if it were a baby. I didn't ask her anything. I just sat beside her. After a long while, she said one single sentence. They took the only good thing I had left, and it wasn't even my fault. I didn't understand what it meant then, but now that I see you here, I think I'm starting to understand." "Can I see her?" Richie asked, his voice choked. "You can, but I warn you, that woman has wounded pride, and wounds of pride take the longest to heal. It won't be easy." Rachel guided him through a narrow corridor to an inner courtyard where several children played under the gentle hum of spotlights. And there, sitting on a wooden bench against the furthest wall, with Sam's guitar resting beside her like a silent companion, was Vanessa Henderson. Richie stopped several meters away. Vanessa's gaze was lost somewhere on the ground, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked thinner than last time, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and days without enough food. But still, even in those conditions, there was something in her posture that refused to break. A dignity that seemed made of a material no humiliation could bend. Tom was the first to see him. The boy was playing with other kids at the shelter when his eyes met Richie's. He froze for a second, as if his brain needed to confirm the image was real and not another of those dreams he had every night where he returned to the estate and danced with Isabella. Then, without a word, he ran to his mother and tugged her sleeve. "Mum," Tom whispered. "Mum, look." Vanessa looked up, and her eyes met Richie Maxwell's, standing in the courtyard of a community shelter, his suit wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed, and an expression that was half relief, half shame. Vanessa's face transformed in a fraction of a second. First came surprise, then confusion, and finally something Richie recognized with painful clarity. Distrust. The distrust of someone who has been betrayed too many times to believe anyone comes with good intentions. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa asked, standing with the same upright posture she had maintained the night she left the estate. "I came looking for you." "For what? To accuse me of something else? Has a necklace disappeared now? A ring? Do you want to check my guitar again to see if I hid a diamond crown?" Every word came out of Vanessa's mouth laden with a pain that had fermented through days of uncertainty, of nights sleeping in a shelter, of mornings explaining to her son why they couldn't go back to the house where he had a friend. "Vanessa," the bracelet was planted. Vanessa fell, silent, but her expression didn't change. "Lucy Fielding put the bracelet inside your guitar case. I have a witness who saw her enter your room that night. It was all a trap, orchestrated to get you out of the house. And why should I believe you?" Vanessa replied with a calm that was more devastating than any shout. "Your mother humiliated me in front of the whole house. She treated me like a criminal in front of my son. And you, Mr. Maxwell, you stood there doubting. I saw how your mother's words made you hesitate. I saw that moment in your eyes. That instant when you considered the possibility that I was guilty. And that instant, that single instant of doubt, hurt more than everything else combined." Richie received those words like punches he knew he deserved. Vanessa was right. He had hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had allowed his mother's voice to weigh more than what his own eyes had seen, more than what his own heart knew to be true. "You're right," Richie said, without attempting to defend himself. "I doubted, and I hate myself for it, but I'm here now. And I didn't just come to tell you you're innocent. I came because I need to tell you something I discovered, something you deserve to know, even if it destroys me to say it." Vanessa looked at him with narrowed eyes, like someone evaluating whether it was worth opening a door that might hide another betrayal. "What?" Richie took a deep breath. What he was about to say could make Vanessa hate him forever. It could destroy any possibility of her returning. But he had learned too late, perhaps, that the truth was the only thing that could heal the wounds lies had caused. "Your husband, Sam, the workshop where he worked, the building that collapsed. That building belonged to a company in my family, Maxwell Holdings. My mother managed that company in those years. She was the one who ordered the legal team to block your lawsuit after Sam's death. The silence that followed was not a normal silence. It was a silence that had weight, texture, temperature, a silence that could be touched and that burned. Vanessa took a step back, as if Richie's words were a physical force pushing her. Her eyes filled with tears that refused to fall, held back by a will that had learned not to break in public. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands began to tremble in a way that made Tom take her fingers with both his small hands, not understanding what was happening but instinctively knowing his mother needed him. "You're telling me," Vanessa began in a voice barely audible, "that Sam died because of your family, that I lost everything, my career, my home, my entire life, because your mother decided it was cheaper to leave me ruined than to take responsibility, and that after all that, I ended up cleaning the floors of the house of the very people who destroyed my world? Yes. You knew about it when you hired me, didn't you? I found out afterwards. My mother was the one who hired you, and now I understand she did it precisely because she didn't want anyone external to remember the case. By having you close, she controlled the situation." Vanessa closed her eyes. The tears finally found their way down her cheeks, silent, constant, like a river breaking a dam that had held back too much for years. "There's something else," Richie said, and his own voice cracked as he uttered the next words. "My wife, Caroline, before she passed away, spent her last weeks at Hope Valley Hospice. A volunteer visited her every day and played the guitar to alleviate her pain. That volunteer was you, Vanessa. You accompanied my wife in her last days, and neither of you ever knew who the other was." Vanessa's eyes snapped open. Her expression changed from pain to disbelief, from disbelief to something that had no name in any language, an emotion so complex and profound it seemed to contain centuries of human history in a single instant. "Caroline," Vanessa whispered. "The woman in the back room. The one who asked me to play that lullaby every afternoon because she said it reminded her of her daughter Richie couldn't answer. Tears won the battle, and he collapsed onto the bench where Vanessa had been sitting moments before, covering his face with his hands as his body shook with sobs that came from a place so deep they seemed to tear pieces from his soul. I used to sing to Isabella, Vanessa continued, and now she also cried without restraint. Caroline talked about her daughter every day. She told me she was the sweetest little girl in the world, that she had a laugh that could light up any room. She asked me that if one day life put me in front of a sad child, I should play that song for them, because that song had the power to heal any pain. The song you played for Isabella that night in the lounge, Richie murmured, looking up. It was Caroline's song, the song my wife taught me for her daughter, without knowing that one day I would end up playing it for her. Tom looked at his mother and Richie, not fully understanding what was happening, but knowing with that sacred intuition of childhood that something very big was breaking and rebuilding at the same time in that shelter courtyard. "Mr. Maxwell," Vanessa said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I didn't know who you were when I accepted the job. I never connected the surname. When I saw Isabella sitting alone on those stairs, all I saw was a sad child. I didn't see the daughter of the man whose family destroyed mine. I saw a child who needed exactly the same thing as my son, someone to remind her that life could still be beautiful. And now that you know everything," Richie asked, with genuine fear in his voice, "now that you know who we are, what we did, what my mother did to you, can you forgive us?" Vanessa looked at her son, who was still holding her fingers with those small hands that didn't understand surnames or companies or legal disputes. Then she looked at Sam's guitar leaning against the wall, waiting in silence as it always did. "Sam taught me something I never forgot," Vanessa said in a firm voice despite the tears. "He told me that music exists to transform pain into something beautiful, that if you get trapped in resentment, the guitar stops playing. And I cannot allow this guitar to stop playing, Mr. Maxwell, because the day it stops playing, I will have lost Sam forever." Richie understood at that moment that Vanessa was not saying she forgave. She was saying something much deeper, that she chose music over hatred, life over revenge, the future over the past. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to honor the man who had put his soul inside a guitar. "Vanessa, I need to ask you something," Richie said, standing up. "And I need you to know that I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for Isabella. My daughter is fading again. The doctor says that if she doesn't regain the connection she had with Tom, we could lose her emotionally permanently. Isabella needs Tom, and she needs your music, the music Caroline unknowingly left her." Vanessa looked at Tom. The boy who had heard Isabella's name looked up with eyes that lit up like two stars igniting in the darkest night. "Mum," Tom said in that voice that could disarm armies. "Bella needs me." And with those 3 words, a child decided the fate of 2 families that life had struck, separated, destroyed, and that now, in the courtyard of a community shelter, had the opportunity to rebuild themselves together with the only material that never runs out, the love that survives everything. The journey back to the estate was the most silent Richie had ever experienced. Vanessa was in the back seat with Tom asleep on her lap, exhausted by the emotions of a night that had been too big for his little body. Sam's guitar occupied the passenger seat as if it were just another passenger, as if it had a right to be there. Vanessa hadn't said she forgave. She hadn't said she was coming back forever. She had only said, "I'm coming for Isabella." And Richie understood that for now, that was enough. It was more than he deserved. When the car stopped in front of the estate, it was almost 2 a.m. The lights on the ground floor were on, unusual at that hour. Richie got out first and opened the main door, expecting to find the house asleep. But the house was not asleep. In the foyer, sitting on a chair with a rigid back and hands clasped in her lap, was Grandma Grace Maxwell. Beside her, standing against the wall with a nervous expression, was Lucy Fielding, and in front of both, with a tablet in his hand and the look of someone who would rather be anywhere else in the world, was Greg Mason. "Sir," Greg said upon seeing Richie enter. "Your mother asked to speak with you tonight." He insisted on waiting for him. Richie looked at his mother cautiously, but something had changed in Grandma Grace. She wasn't the ice queen who gave orders and expected blind obedience. She was something different, something Richie hadn't seen since he was a very small child and his mother still knew how to cry. Vulnerability. Then, Grandma Grace saw Vanessa enter behind Richie with Tom, asleep in her arms, and the guitar slung over her shoulder. The 2 women looked at each other for an instant that contained years of pain compressed into a single gaze. Vanessa didn't lower her eyes. Neither did Grandma Grace. But it was Grandma Grace who spoke first, and what she said made even Greg hold his breath. "Mrs. Henderson, please sit down." That please came out of Grandma Grace's mouth, as if she had had to tear each letter from some deep, rusty place within her, a place where kind words had been stored for decades unused. Vanessa sat with Tom still asleep against her chest. Richie remained standing beside her, unsure what to expect. "After my son left tonight, Grandma Grace began in a low voice. I stayed alone in my study, and for the first time in a long time, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't like what I saw. The silence in the foyer was absolute. Not even Lucy dared to breathe loudly. When my husband died and left me in charge of his businesses, I was a woman who knew nothing about the corporate world. I learned quickly because I had no other choice. But what I learned was to protect what was ours at any cost. Every decision I made was to keep this family afloat, so Richard would have a future, so the Maxwell name would continue to mean something. And in that process, I became someone who stopped seeing people and started seeing only threats." Grandma Grace paused. Her eyes were moist, something Richie hadn't witnessed even at his father's funeral. "When the Maxwell Holdings building collapsed and your husband passed away, Mrs. Henderson, a report with your name reached my desk. You were a line in a legal document, a problem to solve, a risk to neutralize. I never stopped to think that behind that name was a woman with a child, with broken dreams, with a guitar that was the only thing she had left of the person she loved. I erased you from my papers and moved on as if nothing had happened." Vanessa listened without moving, tears silently falling onto Tom's hair. "And when I hired you to work here, I did so because your name appeared on a list of applicants. And something within me, something I didn't want to examine, told me that by having you close, I could ensure the past remained buried. It was an act of cowardice, disguised as control." Grandma Grace stood up slowly with a difficulty that wasn't physical, but emotional, as if the weight of her own words was bending her back. "I'm not going to ask for your forgiveness, because I know there are things that cannot be forgiven with words. But I am going to do something that I should have done a long time ago." She turned to Lucy, who had turned as pale as the foyer marble. "Lucy, you were the one who placed the bracelet in Mrs. Henderson's belongings. Mrs. Marigold saw you enter the room that night, and you were the one who intercepted a letter from the National Conservatory of Music addressed to Vanessa, a letter she never received because you decided she didn't deserve it." Lucy opened her mouth to defend herself, but Grandma Grace raised her hand with that authority that this time was not meant to oppress, but to correct. "I don't need explanations. I need you to hand over the letter right now. And tomorrow morning, first thing, collect your belongings. Your time in this house is over." Lucy looked at Richie, seeking some kind of rescue, some intervention that would save her. But Richie's eyes were fixed on his mother, and what they reflected was not triumph or satisfaction. It was something akin to the astonishment of a son who discovers his mother can still surprise him. With trembling hands, Lucy pulled a crumpled envelope from her jacket and placed it on the foyer table. Then, without a word, she walked to the door and disappeared into the night. No one stopped her, no one said goodbye. Her exit was as silent as all her manipulations had been, only this time the silence didn't hide venom, but defeat. Grandma Grace took the envelope and handed it to Vanessa. "This belongs to you." Vanessa took the letter with trembling fingers, opened it slowly, read its contents, and what appeared on her face was something no one in that room would ever forget. Hope. Pure, unexpected hope. As fragile and powerful as the first note from a guitar that had been silent for years. "It's a scholarship," Vanessa whispered. "The conservatory wants me back. They want me to finish what I started." "And you will," Grandma Grace said, with a firmness that surprised everyone. "Maxwell Holdings will fund every expense that scholarship doesn't cover. Accommodation for you and your son. Materials, transport, everything. Not as charity, but as the debt this family owes you, and which has gone unpaid for too long." Richie looked at his mother, and for the first time in years, he felt that the woman who had raised him, the woman who existed before the business world hardened her, was back, not complete, not perfect, but present. And that was a start. Vanessa held the letter against her chest, as if it were a treasure recovered from the bottom of the ocean. But before she could respond, a sound made everyone in the foyer turn their heads towards the stairs. Small, barefoot steps, descending rung by rung with the caution of children. Isabella appeared at the foot of the stairs, her hair disheveled and her eyes narrowed with sleep. But those eyes opened completely when she saw what was in the foyer, or more precisely, who was in the foyer. "Tom," Isabella whispered. The boy, who had woken with the movement, lifted his head from his mother's lap and looked towards the stairs. Bella. Tom got down from Vanessa's arms and ran towards Isabella. The girl descended the last steps and ran towards him with a speed that belied the emotional lethargy that had consumed her for days. They met in the center of the foyer and hugged with that disproportionate strength children's hugs have when they reunite with someone they thought lost. "You left," Isabella said, her voice breaking. And that two-word phrase contained all the abandonment that child had accumulated, first with the loss of her mother, and then with the disappearance of her only friend. "But I'm back now," Tom replied, with that monumental simplicity that was his gift. "And I brought my dad's guitar so your mummy in heaven can hear us dance again." The song Caroline had taught her filled every corner of Maxwell Manor, like a wave that sweeps away everything old and broken and leaves only what is worth keeping. Isabella and Tom danced hand in hand in the center of the foyer, exactly as they had done that first night, but this time with witnesses who cried and laughed at the same time. Richie knelt beside his daughter, and she pulled him to dance with them. Grandma Grace, standing, supported by the hand of a child who was teaching her something no business or fortune could have taught her, swayed gently to the rhythm of a melody that healed everything it touched. Weeks later, Vanessa returned to the National Conservatory of Music. Her return was news in the country's musical circles, and her former professor, seeing her play Sam's guitar in the first class, said something that would become a legend. Technique can be taught, but what Vanessa has inside is not learned. It is suffered, lived, and transformed into music. Tom enrolled in the same school as Isabella. The two became inseparable, a pair of children who had learned sooner than most adults that shared wounds heal faster than hidden wounds. Sometime later, Grandma Grace established a foundation in Sam Henderson's name, dedicated to ensuring workplace safety conditions for artisans and independent workers. She didn't announce it in the press, she didn't seek recognition. She did it in silence, in the same way she had caused the harm, but this time, leaving behind a trail of repair instead of destruction with each action. And Richie, one ordinary afternoon, came home from work and found the same scene that had changed his life forever. Vanessa playing the guitar in the lounge while Isabella and Tom danced barefoot on the rug. But this time he didn't freeze in the doorway. This time he entered, sat beside Vanessa, and listened to the song his wife had gifted to the world, without knowing that melody would end up uniting the two families who most needed to find each other. That night, before sleeping, Isabella asked her father, "Dad, do you think Mummy and Tom's dad know each other in heaven?" Richie smiled with moist eyes. "I'm sure they do, darling, and I'm sure they're dancing." Isabella closed her eyes with a smile that shone brighter than all the lights in that estate combined. And somewhere in the universe, a lullaby continued to play, strummed by a guitar that contained the soul of a man who fulfilled his promise. As long as those strings vibrated, he would never truly be gone. There are instruments made of wood and strings, but there are others, the most valuable ones, made of love, of loss, of the unbreakable decision to transform pain into the most beautiful melody the world has ever heard. And that guitar, Sam Henderson's last guitar, never stopped playing.